Hey everyone, welcome to the Biopsychology unit. Now I'm going to start off with a quick disclaimer. Those of you who are interested in nursing, who are interested in something in the medical field, who are interested in doing addictions counseling, any of those things, you'll probably find this section fascinating. It's probably going to be pretty easy for you to keep your interest, learning about the biology of the brain, the structures of the brain, the neurotransmitters, the hormones, and how all of them work together. For others of you, you're probably going to get a few paragraphs into this chapter and think, I would rather sit and watch paint dry while in a room full of screaming toddlers than keep reading this, okay? For a lot of people, biopsychology is not the most interesting area. I'm one of those people. Biopsychology was never my top, I find this fascinating. I got through it, but that's not one of the things that makes me tick. And we're all different in terms of what areas of psychology we find interesting. So that being said, I'm not going to sit and summarize for you everything in your chapter with this lecture video. That's just not going to be my goal. Your textbook does explain the brain structure as well. It explains the synapses and the axons and the dendrites and the myelin sheaths, and you get that in your textbook. I'm not going to sit here and just repeat that information to you. I don't know that I could add that much to what your textbook does because, again, this was just never one of my areas in psychology where I felt like, oh, this is so fascinating, I want to dive into it. If you have questions, if something from the textbook is unclear, definitely ask me about them. Send me an email. I should be able to help you out with anything. But I really wanted to use this lecture video to point out some of the more interesting areas of biopsychology and their application. Because if you're sitting there reading this and going, okay, so what? This isn't a biology class. Why are we doing this? It's because there is some really interesting application to some of the things that are discussed in this chapter. So, let's dive in and let's talk about biopsychology and how it relates to some of the more interesting areas of psych. I will minimize myself here so that you can see the slides. So biopsychology, we are talking about the interaction of the body and the mind. And my slides are not moving. There we go. Okay, so first of all, biopsychology does include genetics, right? So anything that's within your biological or genetic functioning within your physical body is fair game in the realm of biopsychology. So some genetic terms that are important to be aware of that can be kind of tricky just based on the textbook descriptions. Your genotype is the combination of genes in your body. Some things that have physical manifestations that you can see and some that don't. Your phenotype is the expression of those genes. Your phenotype is what we can see. There's a whole bunch of other terminology related to genetics, like your alleles and all of that, and your textbook does a great job of summarizing that. Now, it's important to know that when we're talking about the impact of genes on who we are, on our expressions, there are polygenetic influences and single genetic influences. Polygenetic influences are when multiple genes interact to produce a trait. Some examples of these would be height, would be skin color. We've actually done quite a bit of research on how much genes are actually related to your personality, and that would be another example of polygenetic, right? You have a lot of genes that are interacting to produce your personality. Right now, the common belief is that personality is probably about 30-35% genetically influenced. But it's not like you have one single gene that determines, are you somebody who gets angry quickly? Or one single gene that determines how extroverted or introverted you are, right? So it's a polygenetic influence. Well, so then the question becomes, are there single gene traits, or is everything that complicated? And yeah, there actually are several single gene traits. Some entertaining ones, and I'll maximize myself so you can see what I'm talking about here. One of them is the directions that your fingers interlock. So if you go like this and interlock your hands, whether you tend to interlock your hands with your right or your left finger on top is actually genetically influenced. The way that you naturally hold your hands. If I like which way feels more awkward versus which way feels more comfortable. There's actually a genetic influence to that. Another one is your earlobes, whether your earlobes are attached or they're loose. So like how, so my earlobes are detached, right? They don't fully connect. I have floppy earlobes. That's actually a genetic trait that's caused by one single gene. And the other one is known as a hitchhiker's thumb. So a lot of times, if you hold your thumb up, right, most people will hold their thumb like straight up. But some people with their thumb can do like that and bend it back. There's one single gene that determines whether or not you can do this with your thumbs comfortably. So just a lot of weird quirks. And people have tried to do weird things when looking at single genes. So another weird one is it's called your 2D/4D ratio. So look at your hand, okay? Which is longer, your second finger or your fourth finger? Okay? So I have what's called a reduced 2D/4D ratio. My second digit is significantly shorter than my fourth digit. That's a single genetic influence. Well, I don't even know the train of thought that led to this, but one time somebody did a study and they found out that women who had this gene that produced a reduced 2D/4D ratio were also more likely to identify as lesbian or bisexual. So that started this whole train of research about, is somehow this gene that influences your finger length, is that somehow also influencing your sexual orientation? And it led to kind of a comical train of thought in the study, but when we find out there's genetic influences, like, people want to do weird things with them. They want to take them and run. For a while, there was a lot of research on that scientists thought that they had discovered the cheating gene. And if I can find an article, I'll try to link to it in the comments. But they analyzed this whole group of specifically men who were in heterosexual marriages. They analyzed this whole group of heterosexual men who had admitted that they had cheated on their wives. And they did like a genetic analysis of them. And there was one gene that these men all tended to have in common. And so that started this whole train of research of, is there a cheating gene? Is there a cheater's gene? Could you have a genetic analysis on your partner and see if they're going to be more likely to cheat on you? Like, it was kind of comical now looking back on it that we tried to reduce that behavior down to one gene. That if you have this gene, you're destined to be a cheater. But if you don't, hey, you're safe. But so anyway, we do weird things with genetic research, because we want to be able to attribute behaviors to genes. Because it almost seems like if we can provide a genetic explanation, maybe it's not really my fault, right? Like, my genes made me do it. And a lot of behaviorists really draw the line at that point when we're talking about biopsychology. Is we can talk about genetic influence on behaviors, and we can talk about genetic contributions to behaviors. But if you're trying to get to a point of taking away responsibility because my genes made me do it, that's going too far with it, right? We're not just these passive ride-alongs living out what our genes dictate. My genes might dictate how tall I am, and that I have brown eyes, and that my fingers are shaped really weirdly and do weird things. But my genes don't force me into certain behaviors. So that's an important distinction, is that we not become, the technical psychological phrase is overly deterministic. That we don't become overly deterministic in our study of genes. Because, segue in the next slide, we know that genes and environment interact in very important ways. So, I minimize myself again, and let's get back over here and talk about epigenetic effects. So an epigenetic effect is this broad term for any time your genetics interact with your environment in a way that the environment is influencing your genetic expression. And there's two big areas of study within epigenetic effects that I want to draw your attention to. The first one is that of a reaction range. The reaction range is saying that your phenotype equals your genotype plus your environment. And the best example to illustrate this is intelligence. So the idea behind a reaction range is that your genes give you a range that your intelligence will fall into. This is the spectrum of intelligence, and your genes give you a range. So like if we're comparing child A and child B, if this is the whole spectrum of possible intelligence scores, right? Your reaction range is saying child A has the potential to be within this range. Child B has the potential to be in this range. It's setting a range of possible outcomes based on your genetics. And your environment, or the way that you're nurtured, to use nature nurture language, is going to determine where exactly you will fall within that range. So for example, if you have child A and their reaction range is showing their intelligence level will be here, and their parents try very hard to create a super nurturing and facilitative environment, right? They read books with them. They make sure that they have adequate nutrition for brain development. They're always doing enriching and educational activities. There's a good chance that this child's intellect level is going to end up on the high end of the spectrum, right? Because their parents, they had the genes for it, and their parents really facilitated that intelligence. With child B, if their genetic influence is showing their intelligence is going to be lower on the scale, and they had those exact same facilitative and nurturing behaviors for their intelligence that child A had, they're going to still max out their intelligence down here. Excuse me. So the parents can behave in the exact same way for facilitating intellectual development, but this child is still going to come out scoring higher on the intelligence range because their genetics dictated that they had the potential to be higher than what this child's maximum potential was. Now, let's say that child A, that their parents were not very facilitative. They said, you know what, we're both smart. Our kid is going to be naturally smart. We don't need to worry about it. So they just kind of plopped little Timmy down in front of the TV, and they never really did anything to facilitate that education, to facilitate that intelligence. They were really lazy in terms of facilitating intellectual development. Well, there's a good chance that child A is going to fall on the low end of the reaction range. So even though child A's genetics would dictate that they're most likely going to be more intelligent than child B, if child A's parents were kind of lazy about it and child B's parents were very facilitative of it, then child B could end up being smarter than child A. But if child B's parents don't really take it seriously, there's a good chance child B is going to be in trouble and is going to fall all the way down here. So that's the idea of a reaction range, that your genes set a range that you can fall in, and your environment determines where on that range you're going to fall. Fun bonus biopsychology fact: because of how the brain works and how the brain develops, one of the most important ages to really be focusing on developing intellect is in middle school, right around age 12. Because you have these processes in the brain that we call sprouting and pruning, where new neural pathways are being developed, and those are most active right around age 12. So you should take a child's intellectual development seriously for their entire life, of course, but around middle school is where you really want to be concentrating on that. I will end this video here since we're at 14 minutes, and we will pick up with the diathesis stress model in our part 2 video.